Hello, everyone. Welcome to LTEC 676, Social and Ethical Issues in Educational Technology, Session 10. In this video, we're going to discuss three things. First, I want to talk about the outsized expectations that are sometimes foisted onto education. Then I want to review two models of education reform. And then I want to examine technology in this idea of disruptive innovation for failed education systems. So let's get started. 2 weeks ago, we were introduced to Downtown School, which I argued is actually the school named Quest to Learn, the school for digital kids. Sims introduced us to this school in the first chapter of his book, but in his second chapter, he really zooms out considerably and focuses on what he calls outsized expectations. So he zooms out both in scope and in time and focuses on society at large, which we've talked about in this class, in this idea that education is situated inside of society, and this idea that technology is situated inside of society. And we've also talked about societal ills or problems, the conditions or behaviors that have negative consequences for large numbers of people, such as poverty, inequality, so on and so forth. Now, what Sims argues by drawing on Tyack and Cuban's work is that education often becomes a target. He says repeatedly, Americans have followed a common pattern in devising educational prescriptions for specific social or economic ills. And this recurring tendency to translate social, political, and economic concerns into educational problems and solutions has led to a situation in which public education has been asked to solve many problems that are far beyond its reach. So in short, Sims and the researchers that he's citing are arguing that education is often expected to solve society's ills, such as poverty, inequality. And Sims is arguing that those problems are actually beyond the scope of education itself. Now, let's connect this to the notion of education reform. One of the points that Sims talks about repeatedly is that every decade or so, there is a call for education reform. In chapter 2, he talks about a book we've already looked at, the 1983 education report called A Nation at Risk, which we know says that the US's once unchallenged preeminence in commerce, industry, science, and technological innovation is being overtaken by competitors throughout the world. Similarly, there's a 2005 report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. This was written by the National Academy of Sciences. And essentially, the gist of that report is that US students are falling further and further behind international rivals, especially in math and science, and that this inferiority threatens the nation's supremacy as well as citizens' future employment chances. Sim calls out both of these reports because they are calls to education reform. And so let's look at the two dominant strands of education reform in the US. So on the one hand, we kind of have traditional pedagogic reformers, and on the other hand, we have progressive pedagogic reformers. Now, traditional pedagogic reformers really value an established body of curricular content. What students should know and what they should be able to do is more or less standardized. They also view students as passive receivers of knowledge and culture. Traditional pedagogic reformers position teachers and media as transmitters of knowledge and culture. These reformers emphasizes the ends over means. In other words, there's a lot of emphasis on outcomes, such as standardized test scores. And they prefer tightly scripted activities. They want things to be the same so that everybody's having the same experience. Now, in contrast, progressive pedagogic reformers emphasize caring for the whole child, and they try to leverage students' inherent creativity and unique interests, as well as the needs and their domains of familiarity. In other words, let's not look at students from a deficit point of view, but let's look at them and draw on what they already know. Progressive pedagogic reformers also value learners' active involvement in the processes of learning and the production of culture, and they also emphasize the means over the ends. In other words, the processes and the inputs that result in the outcomes are equally as important as the outcomes themselves. So here you can see kind of a side-by-side picture of the dominant strands of education reform in the US. Now, the point that we need to make here is not that one is better than the other, although you may have personal opinions about which one you prefer. The point that Sims is trying to make is that the pendulum swings between the reform efforts of these two camps. And he argues that the failure of education reform, whether it's from the traditionalist perspective or the progressive perspective, actually works as a regenerative force, one that actually just perpetuates the existing problems. So he writes, one reform project's inability to fix problems that are beyond its reach becomes part of the ground from which another project's processes of problemization and rendering technical spring forth. He goes on to say, regardless of which particular approach to reform takes root at a given place and time, the idealization of educational disruption as if not the means to realize more extensive social and political yearnings lives on. In other words, he's saying it doesn't matter which way the pendulum is swinging. People argue that educational disruption is the means to addressing extensive social and political problems. Again, it's this notion of seeing education as the mechanism for addressing social problems. So, what's been happening recently in terms of reform in the United States? Well, Sims argues that the dominant trend in educational reform since the 1980s has a number of characteristics. First, there's been emphasis on centralizing control over educational agendas. Second, there's been efforts at decentralizing responsibility for how those agendas are carried out to local school officials and families. Thirdly, there's been emphasis on implementing market-like conditions that promote choice for families and competition among schools and students. Fourthly, there's been emphasis on relying on standardized metrics that would supposedly make educational outcomes intelligible to centralized authorities as well as families. This is standardized testing and the whole notion behind data-driven education and interest in educational analytics. And finally, there's been emphasis on deploying new information technologies that should facilitate the capture, aggregation, and flow of metrics about performance. So these are some of the recent trends, and I'm sure they're familiar with all of you. The emphasis on the last one on information technology is interesting, and it relates to this idea of trying to disrupt education through technology. So Sims is really asking the question is there any hope for a disruptive innovation? Since so many reports see education as the problem that needs to be solved in order to address social, economic, and political problems, many people are hanging their hat on technology to disrupt education. And the takeaway messages from Sims is this idea that education needs to be more like Silicon Valley. It needs to be more innovative and market-driven. Or education needs to let Silicon Valley principles help disrupt the failed education system. And Sims himself is not actually arguing this, but he's pointing out that many reformers are making this argument. Whether they're traditionalist and or progressive in nature, they have high hopes for technology's ability to disrupt our failed education system. So I want to end here by focusing on the social problem of compounded inequities. And from there, I want to link back to what we've learned about from Linda Darling Hammond, that 50 years after Brown versus Board of Ed, that the differences between whites and non-Asian minority students remain large, and that those differences in access to educational opportunities are growing. And this, of course, is because of compounded inequities. So the question I have for you is it fair to position education as the mechanism to overcome compounded inequities? And is it fair to believe that technology will disrupt education enough that it can overcome these compounded inequities? These are important questions for us to consider as educators thinking about educational technology. Finally, I want to close by looking at the road ahead. We're going to be moving out of the racial and ethnic theme into a focus on gender equity and gender uses of technology. And we'll be doing that by looking at a new book by Meryl Alper called Giving Voice. And this is an in-depth study of whether or not mobile technologies can actually give voice to the voiceless, which I think will be a very interesting subject for all of us. Okay, everyone, that's all we have time for today. Have a great week. I'll see you in Canvas.